By the time Jack Turner turned the corner at the end of the quiet cul-de-sac, the sky was already the wrong kind of orange. It was just past 5 in the morning, that strange hour when the world feels half asleep and half haunted. Most of the little New Hampshire town still lay in darkness, porch lights off, coffee makers not yet gurgling to life. The only sounds were the crunch of Jack's boots on frozen pavement and the soft jingle of the dog tags on Ranger's collar as the German Shepherd trotted a half step ahead. Then Jack saw the fire. Flames were climbing the side of a 2-story house at the curve of the street, licking hungrily up the siding, punching out through shattered windows. Thick black smoke rolled into the pre-dawn sky, glowing from beneath like a furnace door left open. For a beat, the world narrowed to that awful, dancing light. Ranger stopped dead, muscles tensing beneath his coat. A low growl rumbled in his chest, then burst into a sharp, urgent bark that echoed down the empty street. Jack's lungs forgot how to work. The heat, the color of the flames, the way the smoke twisted. It was all too familiar. In a breath, he wasn't staring at a burning house in Maple Ridge, New Hampshire. He was 30 years younger, back in a blasted village half a world away, sand in his teeth, the sky thick with dust and the metallic taste of fear. Someone was screaming for a medic. Someone else was shouting his name. The air smelled like diesel and loss. Then he heard it, a sound that cut clean through the roar of the fire. Thin, high, desperate, a child crying. The street came back into focus with a snap. Not Hellman, not the past. This was a wood frame house with vinyl siding and a swing set in the yard. And somewhere inside it, a little one was still alive. "Ranger," Jack said, his voice rough from the cold and the memories. The dog's ears pricked, eyes locked on the front door as if he'd heard the same cry. "Stay with me." Neighbors were spilling out of their homes now, wrapped in robes and blankets. Bare feet on frozen concrete, phones clutched in shaking hands. Someone yelled, "There's still a kid in there!" But Jack was already moving. He shrugged off his heavy coat as he ran, wrapping it around his arm and tugging the sleeve up over his mouth and nose. It wasn't proper gear, it wasn't much of anything, but he'd gone into burning places with less. The heat hit him before he reached the front steps. It rolled off the house in waves, the kind of heat that dries your eyes and makes you feel like your skin is shrinking. The front door was half hanging from its hinges, paint blistered and smoking. Jack didn't hesitate. He lifted his boot and drove it into the door with the force of a man who had kicked in far worse. The entryway was a tunnel of smoke. Flames crawled along the ceiling, reaching greedy fingers down the walls. The air tasted of melting plastic and scorched wood, bitter and thick. Jack dropped low, heart pounding in his ears, and pulled the jacket sleeve tighter across his mouth. "Hey," he shouted, voice ragged. "Can you hear me? Call out for me." For a moment, there was nothing but the crack and snap of burning timber. Then to his left, somewhere behind the stairs, he heard it again. A thin, choked sob, followed by a cough that sounded much too small. "I've got you," he muttered to no one and to the child both, and started toward the sound. He moved by instinct, the old training operating even as his mind tried to drag him back to other fires, other walls, other cries. Debris littered the hallway, fallen picture frames, a toppled lamp, toys scattered like abandoned thoughts. His arm burned as a falling ember grazed his skin, but the pain barely registered. Pain meant he was still moving. Pain meant he hadn't stopped. Ranger slipped in beside him like a shadow, close enough that Jack could feel the brush of fur against his knee. The dog's head swung back and forth, searching through the smoke. Jack pointed toward the back of the house. "Find," he rasped. "Go on, boy, find." Ranger padded forward, then broke into a determined trot, nose working, ears pinned forward. Jack followed, crouched so low his knees ached, one hand on the scorched wall to steady himself. Every breath clawed at his throat. He almost didn't see her at first. She was curled in the corner under the staircase, half hidden behind a fallen beam, a tiny bundle of pink and soot. A little girl, maybe 3 years old, dress torn at the hem, blonde hair darkened with smoke and ash. Her eyes were huge in her small face, shining with tears that had carved clean tracks down her cheeks. She wasn't crying loudly anymore. Her sobs had gone quiet, the way cries do when a child is nearly out of breath and nearly out of strength. Jack dropped to his knees. The floorboards were hot enough that he felt it through his jeans. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said, as gently as his ruined voice allowed. I'm Jack. I'm here to get you out. Can you move? Her lips parted, but no sound came out, just a wheezing cough. She reached for him anyway, tiny fingers stretching, grasping for something solid in a world gone wrong. That's it, he murmured, sliding his burned arm under her, ignoring the fresh flare of pain. He lifted her against his chest, tucking her face into his shoulder, his jacket wrapping around her like a shield. She was trembling so hard he could feel her teeth chatter against his collarbone. Behind him, something to the house groaned, the sound of timber shifting in ways it shouldn't. Time was slipping away. "Ranger!" Jack shouted. The dog appeared through the smoke as if conjured, materializing out of the haze with his ears sharp and eyes steady. Jack jerked his chin toward the door. "Out now! Show me the way!" Ranger turned without hesitation and moved. Not in panic, but with the focused, practiced urgency of a working dog who had followed his handler through too many nightmares already. He wove through the hallway, avoiding the worst of the falling debris, heading for the faint square of gray that meant open air. Jack followed, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. The little girl coughed weakly against his chest, then clutched at the dog tags that hung at his throat, fingers wrapping around them like they were a lifeline. "You hang on," he whispered, not sure if he was talking to her or to himself. Almost there, just a little farther. They burst through the warped doorway a heartbeat before something heavy gave way behind them with a crash that shook the front yard. The rush of cold winter air slapped Jack in the face like a blessing. He stumbled down the steps and dropped to his knees on the frozen grass. The girl still cradled in his arms. She sucked in the outside air in ragged gulps, coughing and crying and breathing, all of it music. Ranger circled once, then sat right beside them, pressed close enough that Jack could feel the steady heat of him. The dog's chest rose and fell fast, but his gaze swept the street like a sentry, as if he could keep anything else bad from happening just by watching hard enough. The world reappeared around them in pieces, neighbors pressing in with blankets and shaking hands. Someone yelling that the fire trucks were almost there. A woman sobbing. "She's alive, oh thank God, she's alive." Red and blue lights started to strobe faintly at the end of the street, growing closer. Sirens swelled from distant wails to something that rattled in Jack's bones. A paramedic knelt beside him, gloved hands already reaching for the little girl. "We'll take her now, sir. You did good. You're burned. We need to look at your arm. What's your name?" Jack's hearing flickered, the way it sometimes did when the adrenaline began to ebb. For a moment, he just stared at the child as the medic lifted her from his arms, wrapping her in a clean blanket, fitting a tiny mask over her nose and mouth. Her hand, small and sooty, still clung to his dog tags until the very last second, as if she was reluctant to let go of the stranger who had stepped out of the smoke. "Sir," the medic repeated, softer this time, "your name, for the report, for the family." Jack swallowed. The old urge rose up, to give rank and unit instead of a name, to stand at attention, to follow an order. But he wasn't Staff Sergeant Turner anymore. He was just a man who lived alone out past the tree line with a dog and too many memories. "It doesn't matter," he said finally, voice low. He pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the way his knees protested and his burned arm throbbed. Ranger rose with him in one fluid motion. For a moment, Jack watched as the paramedics carried the girl toward the ambulance, as someone gently wiped the ash from her cheeks. Then he turned away from the flashing lights and the gathering crowd. Without another word, Jack and Ranger walked back into the dim line of trees at the edge of the neighborhood, swallowed up by the gray morning, leaving behind a house in ruins, a street full of strangers, and one little girl who would breathe another day because an old soldier could not ignore the sound of a child crying in the dark. By the time Lisa Grant's plane touched down on the East Coast, she already knew something was wrong. She'd been asleep in the narrow first-class seat, neck at an uncomfortable angle, when her phone started buzzing insistently in the half-dark cabin. 2 missed calls from the nanny, one from an unknown local number, a voicemail icon. Even before she listened, a hollow ache opened in her chest. No one calls 3 times at 2 in the morning with good news. She fumbled for her earbuds, hands clumsy, heart picking up speed. The voicemail crackled in her ear, the nanny's voice, high and streaked with panic. "Lisa, it's Mia. There's been a fire. The house, it's bad. The firefighters, they said Emma is okay, she's okay, but you need to come. I'm so sorry, I'm so..." The rest blurred into static and rushing air as the plane descended. By the time the wheels kissed the runway in Boston, Lisa was already halfway unbuckled, fingers shaking so badly she could barely get her bag down from the overhead. The other passengers were waking up slowly, stretching, checking their phones. She moved through them like someone in a dream, murmuring apologies, not really seeing anyone's face. Outside, the winter air knifed through her thin blazer as she ran to the car service stand. She didn't bother with her usual polite tone, didn't mention the name of her company, the board, the investors. None of that mattered. Only one thing did. "My daughter," she told the driver as she tumbled into the back seat. "St. Mary's Hospital in Maple Ridge, please, as fast as you can." The highway blurred past, headlights smearing into pale lines. Lisa stared out the window without seeing the dark trees or the barely waking towns. In her mind, she saw only Emma, 3 years old, stubborn and bright, with mismatched socks and a laugh that bounced off the kitchen walls. She had left yesterday for a 3-day trip to San Diego, promising Emma they would video chat every night. "3 sleeps," Emma had said solemnly, holding up 4 fingers. "Then you come back." 3 sleeps, Lisa had corrected gently, tucking the stray curl behind her daughter's ear. "And then I'm home." She'd kissed her forehead and hurried out the door to catch a flight, her mind already on quarterly projections and product timelines. Now all she could think was, I wasn't there. The car slid into this hospital parking lot just as a pale light began to creep along the horizon. Lisa didn't wait for the driver to fully stop. She pushed the door open and stumbled out, heels sliding on a patch of ice, catching herself on a parked car before she fell. Inside, the emergency department was a blur of white coats and fluorescent lights. The smell of disinfectant and coffee hit her at once. A nurse at the desk looked up with tired eyes. "My daughter," Lisa panted. "Her name is Emma Grant. There was a fire." Recognition flickered across the nurse's face. She softened, her voice lowering. "She's here. She's stable. 3rd door on the left down that hall. She inhaled some smoke, but she's a lucky little girl." Lucky. Lisa barely heard the rest. Her legs carried her down the hall faster than she would have believed possible. The 3rd door stood half open. She pushed it gently and stepped inside. Emma lay on a narrow bed, wrapped in a warm blanket patterned with cartoon stars. Her curls were tangled and streaked with ash. A faint oxygen tube rested beneath her nose. Someone had wiped her face clean, but a smudge of soot lingered near her ear. Her small chest rose and fell, steady, blessedly steady. For a moment, Lisa couldn't move. All the hours in boardrooms, the polished presentations, the public interviews, all of it shrank to nothing against the sight of that little body breathing. Then her knees gave out. She sank to the side of the bed and laid her head on the blanket, tears spilling hot and unchecked. Her hand found Emma's and held it as if someone might try to take it away. "I'm here, baby," she whispered. "I'm here. I'm so sorry I wasn't here before." Emma made a soft, sleepy sound and shifted, her fingers tightening around her mother's. Her eyes fluttered open for just a second, hazy and confused. "Mommy?" Yes, sweetheart, it's me." Lisa pressed kiss after kiss to her daughter's forehead, tasting salt and the bitter ghost of smoke. "You're safe, you're okay." A nurse stepped quietly into the room, checking the monitor, adjusting something on the IV stand. "She really is doing well," the nurse said kindly. "We'll keep her for observation, but the smoke exposure was mild. No burns, someone got to her fast." Lisa lifted her head, swallowing hard. "Who? How did she get out?" The nurse glanced at the chart. "A man brought her in. Neighbor, I think. Former military is what the EMT wrote. He refused treatment, wouldn't give his name, just walked away. He refused treatment. He just walked away. And the dog," the nurse added, almost smiling. "The paramedics said there was a German shepherd with him that wouldn't leave her side until they took her into the ambulance. Sat there like it was on duty." Lisa stared at her daughter's small hand in hers, at the faint outline on the skin where a stranger's dog tags had brushed against it. In her mind, she pictured a faceless figure carrying Emma out through the fire, arms burned, lungs burning, disappearing into the dawn before anyone could say thank you. A man who runs toward the burning house and then vanishes. In another life, in another story, that would have been a myth. For the next 2 days, Lisa barely left the hospital. She slept in the recliner beside Emma's bed, subsisting on vending machine coffee and fear. She answered work emails in short, clipped sentences, told her assistant to cancel meetings, postpone presentations, rescheduled calls. No one argued. Her tone didn't invite it. In the quiet hours, while Emma napped and the monitors beeped softly, the same thoughts circled like tired birds. Someone ran into that fire for my child. Someone walked away without a name. By the time they were discharged and the hospital doors slid shut behind them, the damage to the house was just a charred skeleton at the end of the cul-de-sac. Emma clutched a new stuffed bear the nurses had given her, head resting on her mother's shoulder as Lisa carried her to the waiting car. At home, or what was left of it, neighbors spoke in hushed tones about the man from out near the old mill road. The fire crew mentioned a tall guy in his 50s, quiet, with a service dog and a stubborn refusal to let anyone check his burns. The police officer who'd taken the initial report scratched his head and said, "Fellow named Jack Turner, if I had to guess. Lives alone past the pines, keeps to himself." That night in the borrowed rental house where she and Emma would stay until repairs could even be planned, Lisa sat at the kitchen table with a cup of untouched tea cooling in her hands. On the table lay a check she had written in a rush of gratitude and desperation, the ink barely dry. $50,000. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something tangible in a world where she suddenly understood how fragile everything was. She was a woman who fixed things, who built systems and companies and solutions. Money had always been a tool that could make things right, but for the first time in a very long time, she wondered if she was wrong about that. Still, when the morning came, she got in her car, the envelope on the passenger seat, and drove out past the edge of town into the thin winter woods where the road turned narrow and quiet. She didn't know what she would say when she saw him. She only knew this: she would not let the man who saved her daughter remain a ghost. The road out to the old mill trail grew narrower with every mile. Frost still clung to the ditches, and the trees leaned in close, their bare branches woven overhead like fingers laced in prayer. Lisa drove with both hands on the wheel, the envelope resting on the passenger seat as if it were a second heartbeat. The farther she got from town, the quieter the world became. No traffic, no billboards, no constant hum of people needing something from her. Just the crunch of tires on packed dirt and the occasional rustle of a bird startled from a branch. She almost missed the turn. The cabin sat back from the road, half hidden by tall pines and an old stone wall that had long since given up trying to stand straight. Smoke rose from a short metal chimney, a thin gray line against the pale sky. It was modest, weathered, the kind of place you might drive past a dozen times without noticing. In a world where she spent her days in glass offices and polished conference rooms, the sight of it felt almost unreal, like stepping into someone else's memory. A German shepherd lay on the front steps, head resting on his paws, ears alert despite the lazy position. He didn't bark when Lisa pulled into the clearing. He just watched, calm and steady, eyes following every small movement as if weighing her intentions. Her heart gave a strange little twist. "Ranger," she murmured, remembering what the firefighter had called the dog. The name suited him. Strong, simple, dependable. She turned off the engine and sat for a moment, fingers pressed lightly against the steering wheel. Her breath came out in a soft cloud as she exhaled. For the first time in years, she felt something close to stage fright. You present to rooms full of executives, she told herself. You negotiate contracts worth more than this entire property. You can knock on one door. Still, when she stepped out of the car, her knees felt a touch unsteady. Ranger lifted his head but didn't move, just watched her with that intelligent, measuring gaze. Up close, Lisa could see flecks of white around his muzzle, the faint signs of a dog who had seen a lot of years and probably a lot of hard days. "It's okay," she said quietly, more for herself than for him. "I'm not here to cause trouble." The front door opened before she reached the steps. The man who stepped out was taller than she expected. Broad-shouldered, but not in the polished gym way she saw so often at the office. This was a slower strength, the kind built from lifting real things, wood, tools, weight that mattered. His hair was mostly gray now, cropped short, and lines bracketed his eyes and mouth, deeper than his years probably warranted. His right hand was wrapped in a clean bandage. The skin at his throat was reddened in a way that spoke of heat and smoke. His eyes, a steady, worn blue, took her in with quiet caution. "You must be Jack Turner," Lisa said, forcing her voice not to waver. He nodded once. "Ma'am, I'm Lisa Grant," she continued. We've never met, but I'm Emma's mother." His gaze shifted just for a heartbeat, a flicker of something softer, something that looked almost like relief before it disappeared again. "Is she all right?" he asked. No small talk, no greeting, just that. "She's okay," Lisa said, and the words still felt like a miracle. A little shaken, some smoke inhalation, but no burns, no lasting damage. Doctors say she's incredibly lucky. Jack looked away for a second toward the trees, jaw tightening slightly. "Good," he said simply. Lisa swallowed and remembered why she'd come. The envelope in her hand suddenly felt heavier. "I wanted to thank you," she began, "for going into that house, for bringing her out. There's really no way to—" "You don't have to," he cut in gently, not unkindly. "You already did. You showed up for her. That's what matters now." She blinked, caught off guard by the certainty in his tone. In boardrooms, she was used to being interrupted by overconfidence or ego. This was different. This was a man stating a fact, not an opinion. "I brought something," she said, holding out the envelope before she could think herself out of it. It's a check, $50,000. I know it won't match what you did, it can't, but I have the means to do this, and I need you to know how grateful I am." Jack looked at the envelope, then at her, his expression unreadable. "I don't want your money," he said quietly. Lisa's hand stayed suspended in the cold air. "I understand if it feels strange, but I promise this isn't charity. It's gratitude. You risked your life for my child, for Emma. This is the least I can—" "I didn't do it for a reward," he said. "I heard a little girl crying, that's all." There was no bragging in his voice, no hint of martyrdom. Just a simple truth stated in the same tone he might use to say the sky was gray or the road was icy. Lisa felt heat rise to her face, a mix of embarrassment and frustration and something else, something like admiration. "You ran into a burning house," she insisted, softer this time. "Most people would have waited for the fire department. Most people did." Jack gave the smallest shrug. "I've been in worse places with less gear. She was in there. I was out here. That didn't sit right." Silence stretched between them for a moment. Ranger's tail thumped once against the wooden step, the only sound in the still morning. "You didn't even stay long enough for the paramedics to treat you," Lisa said. "They said you just walked away." "Smoke clears," he replied. "Kids don't always get a second chance. She did. That's enough." His words landed somewhere deep in her chest. Lisa had built a life on fixing problems with resources, with budgets and teams and strategies. This man had stepped into fire with nothing but a coat, a dog, and an old, stubborn sense of duty. "You're the kind of person I wasn't sure existed anymore," she said before she could stop herself. He shifted his weight, looking almost uncomfortable. "I'm just a guy with a dog and a quiet address," he said. "You should keep that check. Put it toward your house, or your girl's college fund. Those things cost more than they used to." He turned slightly, hand on the door, as if the conversation were already over. Ranger rose to his feet with him, ready to follow. Lisa stood there on the path, the envelope still in her gloved hand, her breath puffing out in pale clouds. The CEO in her wanted to argue, to insist, to find the right leverage. The mother in her only felt the weight of the moment. She didn't leave the check behind, but as she walked back to her car, she knew with a clarity that surprised her. There are some debts money will never touch. And there are some people you can't just thank once and drive away from. Driving down the narrow road, the trees closing in again, Lisa found herself replaying the look in Jack Turner's eyes. Not the brief flicker of softness when he'd asked about Emma, but the other thing she had seen there. The eyes of a man who had walked through fire long before her house ever burned. Lisa tried to go back to her life, but her life didn't fit quite right anymore. The next week at Grant Innovations blurred into a series of rooms that all looked the same. Glass walls, sleek tables, screens full of numbers and projections. Her assistant walked beside her, rattling off updates. A licensing agreement in Europe, a supply chain issue in Chicago, a potential partnership in Austin. People called her visionary in articles, relentless in board meetings. But every time she closed her eyes, she didn't see charts or contracts. She saw a small hand tangled in a stranger's dog tags. She saw a quiet cabin in the woods and a man with smoke-burned skin saying, "That's enough," like he really meant it. At home, if she could call the rented townhouse home, Emma's world had already reshaped itself around the fire. Children do that, bending without understanding, making space for what they survived. She told the story in fragments to anyone who would listen. The loud noise, the hot air, the big doggy who had licked her cheek when she couldn't stop coughing. "The dog's name is Ranger," she told her mother one night, sitting cross-legged on the borrowed couch. "The firefighter man told me, Ranger is brave. Yes, Lisa said softly, brushing a curl away from her daughter's face. He is. Can we see him again? Emma asked, as casually as if she were asking to visit the park. I miss him. He made the scary part less scary. The question lodged itself under Lisa's ribs. She thought of the man on the porch, the way he had stood like someone more comfortable at a distance. She thought of how quickly he had tried to retreat back into the quiet woods. Maybe, Lisa said. If he's okay with visitors. The truth was, she didn't know if he would be. But the idea of never seeing him again, of letting the man who saved her daughter fade into a single story told at holidays, felt wrong. It felt unfinished. 3 days later, she found herself back on that narrow road. This time, she didn't bring an envelope. She brought cinnamon bread. It was a recipe from her mother. One of the few domestic things Lisa still felt sure-footed about. The kitchen in the rental house had filled with the warm, comforting smell as she baked. Emma standing on a chair to sprinkle cinnamon sugar, leaving little piles in the wrong spots, and licking it off her fingers when she thought her mother wasn't looking. For the hero and ranger, Emma declared, proud of the slightly uneven loaf. So they're not hungry. Now, standing at the bottom of the cabin steps once more, Lisa took a breath, the cold air stinging her lungs, and knocked. Ranger appeared first, as if materializing from the sound. His tail gave a cautious wag. A second later, the door opened and Jack stood there, looking much the same. Bandage now replaced by pink healing skin, eyes no less guarded. Miss Grant, he said, as if he'd expected she might appear again. Everything all right? Yes, she said quickly. At least as all right as things can be after, well. She lifted the basket in her hands, suddenly feeling absurdly self-conscious. We brought this. It's cinnamon bread. My daughter insisted it's for you and Ranger. She drew you a, well, you'll see. She hadn't meant to say we, but the word had slipped out, easy as breathing. Jack's gaze flicked past her then, toward the driveway. Lisa turned to see Emma climbing carefully out of her car seat, clutching a piece of paper with both hands as if it were treasure. Mom, can I say hi to the doggy? She called, voice bright, the way only a child's could be a week after nearly losing everything. Jack hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then he stepped aside. Yeah, he said quietly. She can come. It became a quiet pattern after that, as natural and unplanned as the changing of seasons. Every few days, when the weather wasn't too bitter, Lisa's car would roll up the old road. Sometimes she brought muffins from a bakery in town, sometimes soup in a thermos. Once, on a rare free afternoon, she brought nothing but herself and Emma, feeling strangely nervous to arrive empty-handed. Emma would tumble out first, boots thumping on the dirt, running toward Ranger with absolute trust. The dog met her with a kind of gentle seriousness, lowering his head just enough for her to wrap her arms around his neck. She would sit on the top step with him, leaning against his side, whispering stories only he could hear. Lisa watched, and she noticed things. She noticed how Jack always put a small mat by the door when the snow was heavy, easing it closer to the edge of the porch on days Emma came, so she'd have a place to stomp her boots. She noticed how he never raised his voice. Not with Emma, not with the dog, not even when he dropped a piece of firewood on his foot and muttered something under his breath. She noticed how, on her second visit, there was a chipped mug waiting on the porch rail. Thought you might want coffee, he'd said, almost offhand. I make it strong. Habit. In town, when Lisa's meetings permitted, she began to ask questions in the grocery store, at the hardware counter, in the line at the post office. You know that cabin out past the mill trail? She'd say casually. Jack's place, the retired police officer at the diner replied, as if there were no other cabins it could be. He stirred his coffee slowly. Served in the Marines. Lost his closest buddy to an IED. That boy saved Jack's life, or so they say. Jack came back, but part of him didn't. Keeps to himself. Good man, though. Never caused trouble. Fixes things for people who don't have the money to hire anyone. Another neighbor chimed in one afternoon, tucking canned goods into a paper bag. He's always been like that. Quiet, solid. Showed up at my place once when my generator died in a blizzard. Stayed till 3 in the morning to get it going. Wouldn't take a dime. Those stories settled around Lisa like pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known she was working on. One late afternoon, when the sky stretched pale and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke, Emma came racing around the side of the cabin, cheeks flushed, eyes sparkling. Mommy, come see, she called. Come see my chair. Lisa followed her to the front steps and then stopped, blinking. Next to the door, there sat a small wooden chair. The wood was freshly sanded, pale and smooth, the legs a little uneven, the back slightly crooked. It was clearly handmade, clearly imperfect, and clearly built with more care than skill. Carved into the top rail were the words, uneven and earnest, Emma's spot. Did you? Lisa began, turning to Jack. He was standing by the workbench just off the porch, wiping sawdust from his hands with an old rag. He looked almost embarrassed to be caught. She's always sitting on the steps, he said, glancing at Emma, who had already plopped into the chair with her stuffed bear in her lap. Figured she deserved a proper place. It's nothing fancy. Lisa reached out and traced the carved letters with her fingertips. They were rough in places, shallow in others, but each one was deliberate. You carved her name, she said softly. More or less, he admitted. Lettering's not exactly my specialty. It's perfect, Lisa replied, and she meant it more than he knew. Emma swung her legs happily, heels thumping the lower rung. This is my spot now, she announced. Me and Ranger and Toasty. Toasty? Jack asked, one eyebrow lifting. My bear, Emma said patiently, as if that should have been obvious. Because I got him when my room got too hot. Lisa's heart squeezed. Jack's eyes softened. The sun slid lower, turning the light honey gold. Lisa found herself sitting on the edge of the porch, Ranger stretched nearby, Emma humming to herself in her new chair, swinging her legs. For once, the persistent buzz of her phone stayed buried in her coat pocket, unanswered. Jack lowered himself onto the step beside her with a quiet grunt. They didn't speak for a while. The wind whispered through the pines. Somewhere far up the hill, a crow called and then fell silent again. It was the kind of silence Lisa wasn't used to. Not the heavy silence of tension in a boardroom. Not the exhausted silence of late-night hotel rooms after endless flights. This silence felt full. Like there was room in it for thoughts to settle and hearts to rest. Want to learn something special? Jack's voice broke the hush. Lisa turned to see him crouching in front of Emma, his old knees protesting. Emma nodded eagerly, curls bouncing. He pursed his lips and let out a sharp whistle. Not loud enough to startle, but clear. Ranger, who had been pretending to nap, instantly lifted his head and trotted over, sitting neatly in front of him. Your turn, Jack said. Emma tried. The first attempt produced nothing but a puff of air and a giggle. The second was a thin squeak. On the third try, a faint but real note slipped free. Ranger's ears flicked. He heard me, Emma gasped. Told you, Jack said, a hint of a smile in his voice. Just takes practice. Good things usually do. Lisa watched them. Her daughter, laughing and determined. The weathered man kneeling beside her. The loyal dog sitting patiently, waiting for his next quiet command. And something in her chest unknotted just a little. It wasn't a family, not yet. Not anything that could be named or labeled comfortably. But it was something. Something gentle and unexpected, flickering to life in the aftermath of fire. In a small cabin at the edge of the woods, in the steady presence of a man who kept insisting he wanted nothing, and yet kept giving more than he would ever admit. On Christmas Eve, the cabin felt quieter than usual. Jack stood at the small window over the sink, mug in hand, watching the pale winter sun sink early behind the trees. It had snowed the night before, a light dusting that softened the rough edges of the world. Ranger lay on the rug near the wood stove, half asleep, one ear cocked in case his name was needed. For years, Christmas had been something to get through, not something to look forward to. In the service, it had meant care packages with stale cookies and phone calls that cut out at the worst moments. After he came home, it meant closed stores, too much silence, and memories that showed up uninvited at the edges of his mind. He had long ago stopped putting up decorations. A wreath felt like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. This year, though, the day didn't feel quite as empty. On the table lay a card, the front covered in overlapping crayon hearts and lopsided stars. Inside, in careful block letters with backwards R's, someone had written, "Please come to dinner with us. Love, Emma." Below it, in Lisa's smooth handwriting, there was a line, "We'd love to have you, if you feel up to company. 6 o'clock. No pressure." Jack had stared at the card longer than he'd meant to when it first arrived, his thumb tracing one of the crooked stars. No pressure, she'd written, but something about it had felt heavier than that. like an invitation not just to dinner, but to step, even briefly, out of the life he'd built around being alone. He looked at the old clock on the wall. If he was going, he needed to go. Ranger lifted his head as Jack shrugged on his coat. "You're coming," Jack said. I said. "They'd riot if you didn't." The dog thumped his tail once, as if he'd already known. The house Lisa had rented while she figured out what to do about the ruined one was smaller than the pictures that used to run alongside articles about her. No grand staircase, no sweeping views. But as Jack stepped onto the porch, he heard laughter from inside, smelled cinnamon and something that might have been roasted chicken. He hesitated for a heartbeat, old habits tugging him back. He could still turn around, claim he'd forgotten, say it was too much. Then the door flew open. "Uncle Bear!" Emma launched herself at him before he could even raise a hand to knock. The nickname had appeared one afternoon without warning, after she'd hugged him around the middle in her new chair and announced, "You're like a big bear, but not the scary kind. The kind that's warm." The uncle had arrived a few visits later, as if it had been waiting in the wings. Now she barreled into him, glitter dusting her hair, a pink dress puffed out around her like a flower. Jack caught her with a soft grunt, his free hand automatically finding her back. "Hey, kiddo," he said, and the words came easier than they once would have. "What's this you're wearing? You joining a royal court after dinner?" "It's my Christmas princess dress," she said matter-of-factly. "You have to look fancy on special days. Mom said so." Behind her, Lisa appeared, wiping her hands on a dish towel printed with tiny snowflakes. She wore a dark green sweater and jeans, nothing elaborate, but Jack had to remind himself to look away before he stared. "I'm glad you came," she said, and there was nothing businesslike in her smile. It was warm, a little unsure, like someone who'd invited a stranger in and was still quietly hoping they'd say yes. "Thanks for the invite," he replied. Inside, the house glowed with a kind of effortful coziness. A small artificial tree stood in the corner, draped with white lights and paper ornaments clearly made by small hands. Rings of construction paper, stars cut a bit too close to the edges. A garland of pine branches lay across the mantel, more lumpy than elegant, anchored by two mismatched candles. "It's a work in progress," Lisa said, following his gaze. "My mother used to make the house look like a magazine every December. I'm still learning." "Looks just right to me," Jack said honestly. Emma tugged on his sleeve. "I made you something." She shoved a card into his hand, the paper soft from being handled too much. On the front, in thick crayon lines, she'd drawn a stick figure with big arms, a smaller figure with curly hair, and a dog that took up half the page. Above them, in wobbly letters, "Uncle Bear." He opened it carefully. Inside, crooked words declared, "To Uncle Bear because you are brave and warm like a real Christmas bear." Jack's throat tightened unexpectedly. His fingers brushed the words twice before he trusted himself to speak. "This might be the best Christmas card I've ever gotten," he said quietly. "Remind me to find a frame that does it justice." Lisa watched him from the doorway to the kitchen, something softening in her expression. She had seen people applaud him at that community event after the fire, had watched strangers reach out, wanting a piece of his story. He had handled all of that with a kind of polite distance, but one child's card, written in crayon, had slipped past his defenses. While she went back to check the oven, Jack wandered into the living room with Emma. He noticed one string of lights along the wall flickering uncertainly, half of it dark, the other half struggling. "Those have been doing that all week," Lisa called from the kitchen. "I was going to call someone tomorrow." Jack crouched beside the outlet, tracing the wire with practiced fingers. "You don't need someone," he said. "Just a steadier connection." He unplugged, twisted, adjusted, and plugged back in. The entire strand blinked, then settled into a steady glow. The room brightened by a fraction, enough to make the windows shine. "Ta-da! Emma shouted, clapping. "Uncle Bear fixed Christmas!" "Sometimes it just takes someone willing to get close to the mess," he replied. He hadn't meant it to be any more than a comment about faulty wiring, but when he glanced up, Lisa was watching him with a look that said she'd heard more. Dinner was simple. Roast chicken that leaned a little dry, mashed potatoes, green beans, and rolls that had clearly spent an extra minute or two in the oven. Emma narrated the entire meal, explaining school projects, her theory that Santa used drones now to be more efficient, and her conviction that Ranger understood every word humans said. Jack found himself laughing more than he expected. the sounds strange in his own ears at first and then less so. After dessert, store-bought pie, Lisa sheepishly admitted she hadn't had time to bake. Emma curled up between Ranger and Jack on the couch, clutching her bear. "Tell me a story," she murmured, eyelids drooping. "Not the scary kind, the kind where someone finds their way home." Jack cleared his throat, the old habit returning. But for once, he didn't deflect. "Once," he began slowly, "there was a little girl who lived in a house at the end of a quiet street. One night, the world got loud and bright and wrong. But she was brave, and the people who loved her were brave too. And even though some things burned down, not everything did. Some things were waiting, just a little farther down the road." Emma's breathing evened out, her hand relaxing around his sleeve. By the time he finished the simple tale, she was asleep, cheek pressed against Ranger's side. Lisa came back from tucking a blanket over Emma's legs to find Jack standing in the doorway, coat in hand. "Thank you," she said softly as she opened the front door. Snow had started falling again, thin flakes drifting through the porch light. "For coming, for all of it, for..." He nodded. "Thank you for trusting me enough to invite me." For a moment, neither stepped back. The cold air curled around them, the warmth from inside lingering on their skin. No declarations passed between them, no sudden sweeping promises. But in that quiet doorway, with snow catching on his coat and soft lines of fatigue around her eyes, something shifted. Not yet love, but no longer just strangers tied together by a fire and a debt that couldn't be paid. Somewhere between those 2 points, a different kind of beginning had taken root. The week after Christmas, the world seemed to exhale. Snowbanks on the sides of the road settled into softer shapes. The town's decorations looked a little tired, as if the lights themselves were ready for a rest. Life crept back into its normal patterns. School buses rumbling in the mornings, delivery trucks making their rounds, inboxes filling up again. At the cabin, not much changed. Jack split wood in the mornings, breath puffing white in the air. He took long walks with Ranger along the frozen stream, boots leaving clear prints on the crust of snow. In the evenings, he cooked simple meals, washed the same few dishes, read the same worn paperbacks. But something beneath the surface had shifted, and he knew it. There was a Christmas card propped carefully on the windowsill now, crayon hearts blurring slightly where Emma's enthusiastic coloring had pressed too hard. A pink hair tie, forgotten on his porch railing, still lay where he'd found it, as if moving it would break some fragile thread. Even the silence in the house felt different, less like a wall, more like a pause. He was pouring coffee one gray afternoon when headlights cut briefly through the trees outside. Ranger's ears flicked. Jack set the mug down, wiped his hands on a dish towel, and stepped to the window. It was Lisa's car. Just one silhouette this time. He frowned slightly. No small figure bouncing in the back seat, no curls pressed against the glass. For some reason, that made his chest tighten in a way he didn't understand. By the time she reached the porch, Ranger was already there, tail giving one slow wag. Lisa stood with her hands tucked into the pockets of a long coat, hair lifted slightly by the wind. There were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there at Christmas. Jack opened the door. "Everything okay?" he asked, skipping hello, jumping straight to what mattered. She smiled, a quick flash that didn't quite reach all the way. "Emma's fine," she said, reading his worry with ease. "She's at a friend's house, practicing a very serious dance routine for New Year's Eve. I actually came to talk to you." "About what?" She hesitated, as if deciding whether to step into a deeper pool. Then she straightened her shoulders, the familiar CEO posture slipping into place, but her voice stayed softer than it ever was in interviews. "About work," she said, "about my company, about a job I think only you can do." Jack blinked. Of all the things he'd expected to hear, that wasn't on the list. "I'm not looking for a paycheck," he said slowly. "I've got what I need out here." "I know," she replied. "And if this were just about money, I wouldn't be here. May I come in for a minute?" He stepped aside without thinking. She brushed past, bringing with her the faint scent of winter air and something warm from the car heater. Ranger settled back onto the rug, choosing a spot that gave him a clear line of sight to both of them. Lisa looked around this cabin. She'd been here before, but today her gaze lingered on the shelves Jack had built himself, the careful stacks of firewood, the dog's worn toys in the corner. It was a life boiled down to essentials. "My company has been working on something new," she began. We've always built medical tools, monitoring systems, telehealth platforms, that kind of thing. But over the last year, we started developing software specifically for veterans with PTSD. Tools to track symptoms, connect with therapists, build peer support. It's still early, but it's promising. Jack's jaw tensed almost imperceptibly at the word PTSD. He didn't correct her. He never liked labels much, even when they fit. We've got brilliant engineers, she continued. Talented clinicians, people who care. But what we don't have is someone who's lived it. Someone who understands what it feels like when the noise is gone, but the war isn't. Someone who knows what it's like to come home and still not feel home. Her eyes met his steadily. She didn't look away when his expression hardened for a moment, old defenses twitching. I'm not asking you to be a spokesperson, she added, or a mascot. God knows you've already had enough of people trying to turn your story into something they can use. I'm asking if you'd consider working with us. Part-time, flexible hours, security, consultation, whatever feels right. You'd be helping shape something real. Something that might keep someone else from falling as far into the dark as you did. Jack looked away toward the window. The trees were motionless, branches etched against the pale sky. Enough time passed that Lisa began to wonder if she'd pushed too far. You think software can fix what war breaks? He asked quietly. No, she said, just as quietly. I think nothing can fully fix it, but I think the right tools can help someone feel less alone inside their own head. And that's not nothing. He let out a slow breath. I don't like offices, he said, almost more to himself than to her. I don't understand half the tech you people design. I call my tablet the Thing because I keep forgetting what it's actually called. Her mouth tilted at the smallest hint of a smile. We can work around that, she said. I'm not offering you a role because you like fluorescent lights. Silence settled again, thicker this time. Ranger shifted, laying his head on his paws. I'll think about it, Jack said at last. Lisa nodded. That's all I can ask. She moved toward the door, then paused, fingers resting on the frame. Jack, she said softly. Yeah? You told me once that sometimes you go into the fire because you're the one who can. This is different, I know, but it's another kind of fire. If you ever feel like stepping into it, the door's open. He didn't answer. She didn't press. The door closed behind her with a gentle click. Jack stood in the middle of the cabin, listening to the quiet, the echo of her words lingering like smoke. For the next 2 weeks, the question walked beside him. It followed him out to the woodpile, stood with him on the frozen trail, sat across the table while he ate his simple dinners. He would imagine himself back under fluorescent lights, surrounded by shiny devices and people who spoke in acronyms. His stomach would tighten. Then he'd remember the way Lisa's voice had dipped when she talked about veterans who didn't have anyone sitting at their kitchen table at night. His chest would tighten for a different reason. On a Tuesday morning made of gray sky and thin snow, he ran his thumb over the crayon card on his windowsill and thought of something his old CO used to say. Sometimes, Turner, courage isn't running toward gunfire. Sometimes it's walking into a room that reminds you who you were before it started. 3 days later, he stood in front of a building of glass and steel with a visitor badge clipped awkwardly to his shirt. Grant Innovations looked exactly like he'd expected a modern tech company to look. Bright, sleek, full of people who walked with purpose while carrying coffee cups. He felt like someone who had stepped off the wrong bus. But when the elevator doors opened on the second floor and he saw Lisa waiting there, eyes lighting in genuine surprise that he'd come, something steadied inside him. You showed up, she said, unable to keep the little smile from her face. I said I'd think about it, he replied. Turns out thinking only gets you so far. Sometimes you just have to walk through the door. He didn't know it yet. But that simple step into a place full of humming machines and hopeful prototypes would be the beginning of a different kind of mission. One that asked him not to forget where he'd been, but to let it mean something more than just survival.